Mary and her granddaughter Lily entered the cozy restaurant, a rare treat for the pair. The dim lighting and soft music created a welcoming atmosphere. But for Mary, it was more than just a meal out. It was a cherished moment. She had saved up for weeks to afford this special outing, wanting to give Lily a memory she wouldn't forget. Mary's worn dress, carefully ironed, and Lily's simple yet neat outfit spoke of their modest means. Yet, tonight was about more than appearances. It was about love and connection. As they sat down, Mary couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and anxiety. She rarely indulged in such luxuries, always prioritizing Lily's needs over her own desires. This evening was meant to be a break from their daily struggles, a chance to celebrate Lily's birthday in a way they seldom could. Lily's excitement was palpable, her eyes wide as she looked over the menu. For Mary, seeing her granddaughter's joy was worth every sacrifice, every penny saved. Despite the warmth between them, Mary began to notice a growing discomfort. A young waitress, who had initially been polite, seemed to be watching them more closely than the other customers. Her glances, initially fleeting, became more pointed, as if she were searching for something. Mary's heart sank as she wondered if they were out of place in this more upscale setting. The waitress's gaze made her feel exposed, her insecurities bubbling to the surface. Lily, unaware of the tension, continued to chat happily, describing her day at school in vivid detail. Mary tried to focus on her granddaughter's words, but the waitress's scrutiny was hard to ignore. Each glance felt like a judgment, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Mary's stomach tightened with unease, her earlier excitement now tinged with worry. She began to question if this special evening was a mistake, if they truly belonged in this world of polished tables and soft candlelight. The other diners seemed oblivious at first, wrapped up in their own conversations. But as the evening progressed, Mary felt more and more eyes on them. The waitress's behavior had not gone unnoticed, and whispers began to ripple through the restaurant. Mary's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her water. She had wanted this night to be special, but now it felt like they were on display, their every move scrutinized. As the meal continued, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Mary could sense that something was about to happen, the waitress's persistent glances fueling her anxiety. Lily's laughter began to fade into the background as Mary's thoughts spiraled. She worried about the cost of the meal, whether they would be able to pay the bill without incident. But deeper than that was the fear of being judged, of being seen as less than the other patrons in the room. Finally, as they finished their meal, the waitress approached their table once more, her expression now one of barely concealed suspicion. Mary's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the young woman's eyes flicker between her and Lily. The waitress hesitated, then took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. Mary's hands tightened around her purse, her breath catching in her throat. The sense of foreboding that had been building all evening now loomed over them. "Is everything all right?" Mary asked, her voice trembling slightly as she forced herself to meet the waitress's gaze. The question hung in the air, a desperate attempt to diffuse the tension. But the waitress didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked around, as if seeking support from the other diners. Mary felt a cold sweat on her brow. The joyful evening she had envisioned slipping further away with each passing second. The waitress finally spoke, her voice cold and accusatory. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone implying far more than her words. Mary's heart sank as the waitress continued, her words cutting through the remaining warmth in the room. The eyes of the other diners were now fully on them, their whispers growing louder as they waited to see what would happen next. Mary could only sit frozen, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty, as the evening took a turn she hadn't anticipated. The air in the restaurant grew thick with tension as the waitress's words hung in the air. Mary's face flushed with a mix of shock and humiliation as the accusation set in. The waitress, with her arms crossed and a look of disdain, didn't back down. She believed she had caught Mary trying to slip something into her purse, a salt shaker, perhaps, or a piece of silverware. The idea was absurd, but the waitress's tone was anything but joking. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Mary's heart raced as she struggled to find her voice. She looked around, hoping for some sign of understanding from the other patrons, but all she saw were curious, judgmental eyes. The murmurs began to grow louder, a low buzz of gossip spreading through the room like wildfire. Mary, normally so composed, felt her hands begin to shake. She had never been accused of anything like this before, and the sheer absurdity of it left her momentarily speechless. "Excuse me, but I think there's been a mistake," Mary finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The waitress narrowed her eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Mistake?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "I saw you with my own eyes. Don't try to lie your way out of this." The harshness in her tone cut through Mary, each word a dagger that deepened her shame. Lily looked up at her grandmother, confused and frightened by the sudden shift in the evening's mood. Lily's innocent gaze only added to Mary's torment. She had brought her granddaughter here to celebrate, to create a memory of joy and togetherness. Now, that memory was being twisted into something ugly and painful. Mary's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to diffuse the situation, to protect Lily from the growing hostility. But the waitress was relentless, her words sharp and unforgiving. "If you can't pay for your meal, just say so. But stealing? That's low, even for someone like you." The insinuation in the waitress's words was clear, and it stung like a slap to the face. Mary had always prided herself on her honesty, her integrity. To be accused of theft, in front of her granddaughter no less, was a blow she hadn't been prepared for. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in as the whispers grew louder. She felt her breath hitch, panic beginning to rise in her chest. She needed to say something, do something before this spiraled even further out of control. "I didn't take anything," Mary said, her voice firmer this time, though still tinged with desperation. She opened her purse, turning it inside out to show its meager contents. A handkerchief, a small wallet, and a crumpled receipt. "See? There's nothing here." But the waitress remained unconvinced, her expression hard and unyielding. The other diners watched with a mix of fascination and discomfort, their whispers now turning into outright commentary. Mary could feel their judgment, their assumptions about her, and it made her feel small, vulnerable. Lily, sensing her grandmother's distress, reached out and took Mary's hand. The simple gesture brought tears to Mary's eyes, the kindness of it a stark contrast to the coldness surrounding them. She squeezed Lily's hand, drawing strength from the little girl's presence. "Please," she whispered to the waitress. "There's been a misunderstanding." But the waitress seemed immune to Mary's pleas, her mind already made up. To her, Mary was guilty, and nothing would change that. As the confrontation dragged on, the restaurant manager finally appeared, drawn by the commotion. He was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression that suggested he was not someone to be trifled with. The waitress quickly recounted her version of events, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. Mary watched in silence, her heart pounding in her chest as the manager listened intently. She could see the doubt in his eyes as he glanced between her and the waitress, trying to piece together the truth. When the waitress finished, the manager turned to Mary, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to check the table," he said, his voice calm but firm. Mary nodded, too exhausted to argue. She stepped aside as the manager inspected the table, lifting the plates and checking the utensils. Each second felt like an eternity, the weight of the room's judgment pressing down on her. Lily clung to her side, her small hands still gripping Mary's, offering silent support. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, the manager straightened up, holding the salt shaker in his hand. "It was under the napkin," he said, his tone neutral. The waitress's face fell, her certainty crumbling as the truth came to light. Mary's relief was palpable, but it was quickly overshadowed by the lingering humiliation. The damage had been done, the evening marred by the accusation. The whispers continued as the manager handed the salt shaker back to the waitress, his expression stern. "There's no theft here," he said firmly, his words hanging in the air like a final judgment. Just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, a voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "That's enough," the voice said, calm yet commanding. The restaurant owner, Mr. Harris, had stepped into the scene, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. He was a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a kind yet firm expression. The entire room turned its attention to him, the whispers dying down as they waited to see what he would do. Mary felt a glimmer of hope, though uncertainty still gripped her heart. The waitress, who had been so sure of herself moments before, faltered at the sight of Mr. Harris. "Sir, I was just," she began, but Mr. Harris held up a hand to silence her. "I've heard enough," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned to Mary, his expression softening as he took in the scene before him. A frightened grandmother, her wide-eyed granddaughter, and the table that had become the center of unwanted attention. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am," he said gently. Mary opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. The mix of relief and lingering humiliation was overwhelming. She could see the sincerity in Mr. Harris's eyes, but it did little to erase the pain of the accusation. Mr. Harris glanced around the room, aware of the many eyes watching, waiting for his next move. He knew that this wasn't just about defusing the situation. It was about restoring the dignity that had been so carelessly stripped from Mary. "Let's clear this up, Mr. Harris continued, his voice steady. He gestured to the waitress, who reluctantly handed over the salt shaker that had caused all the trouble. "This belongs on the table, not in anyone's pocket," he said, placing it down with a decisive motion. The simple act was enough to signal to the room that the matter was settled, but Mr. Harris wasn't finished. He turned back to Mary, his eyes kind but serious. "I'd like to offer you and your granddaughter dessert on the house," he said, his tone warm yet firm. Mary hesitated, unsure how to respond. The offer was generous, but the emotional toll of the evening had left her weary. She glanced at Lily, who looked up at her with hopeful eyes, still too young to fully grasp the gravity of what had happened. Mr. Harris noticed the hesitation and added, "It's the least we can do after this unfortunate misunderstanding." His words were genuine, and slowly, Mary felt herself relax just a little. She nodded, a small, grateful smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. As the waitress moved away to retrieve the dessert, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The other patrons, sensing that the drama had reached its conclusion, returned to their meals, though the atmosphere remained subtly altered. Mr. Harris stayed by the table, ensuring that Mary and Lily were comfortable, his presence a reassuring anchor in the aftermath of the confrontation. He wanted to make sure that their experience ended on a positive note, despite the rocky start. "I hope this hasn't ruined your evening, Mr. Harris said softly, addressing Mary with a touch of concern in his voice. She shook her head, though her eyes still held traces of the earlier distress. "It was supposed to be a special night," Mary admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. Mr. Harris nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. He had seen enough in his years running the restaurant to know that for some, a night out was more than just a meal. It was a cherished occasion, often hard-earned and deeply meaningful. Mr. Harris's own past flickered in his mind as he looked at Mary and Lily. He had grown up with his grandmother, a woman much like Mary, who had sacrificed so much for him. She had taught him the value of hard work, integrity, and kindness. lessons that had stayed with him long after she had passed. In this moment, he saw his grandmother's spirit in Mary, and it stirred something deep within him. This wasn't just about resolving a misunderstanding. It was about honoring the memory of the woman who had shaped his life. As the dessert arrived, a modest yet delicious slice of cake, Mr. Harris made sure it was presented with care. Lily's eyes lit up at the sight, her earlier fear replaced by the innocent delight of a child. Mary watched her granddaughter, her heart swelling with a mix of love and gratitude. The evening hadn't gone as planned, but in this small act of kindness, she found solace. Mr. Harris lingered a moment longer, watching the scene unfold, before quietly excusing himself, satisfied that he had done the right thing. The waitress, now humbled, returned to her duties with a quieter demeanor. She had misjudged Mary, allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, and it was a lesson she would not soon forget. As she moved through the restaurant, she couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harris's face when he had intervened, disappointed but also understanding. It was a look that would stay with her, reminding her of the importance of empathy and the dangers of jumping to conclusions. After the waitress left, Mr. Harris lingered near the table, sensing that there was more to be said. The dessert had brought a momentary smile to Lily's face, but he could see the sadness still lingering in Mary's eyes. He pulled up a chair, gently asking if he could join them for a moment. Mary, surprised by the gesture, nodded silently. She wasn't used to such attention, especially from someone in Mr. Harris's position. It was a small act, but it made her feel seen, respected. Mr. Harris settled into the chair, the warm light of the restaurant casting soft shadows across his face. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a quiet, reflective tone. "You remind me of someone very dear to me," he began, his voice tinged with a mix of nostalgia and warmth. Mary looked at him, curiosity piqued, as he continued. "My grandmother was a lot like you, strong, proud, always putting others first." His eyes grew distant as he recalled memories long tucked away, the edges of his lips curling into a bittersweet smile. Mary listened intently, the tension of the evening slowly easing as Mr. Harris shared his story. He told her about his childhood, growing up under the care of his grandmother after his parents passed away. She had worked tirelessly to provide for him, often going without so that he could have the things he needed. "She was my rock," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I've done in my life, I owe to her." The sincerity in his words resonated deeply with Mary, who felt a pang of recognition in his story. Lily, sensing the shift in the conversation, leaned in closer to her grandmother, her small hand still holding the fork that had been savoring the dessert. She looked up at Mr. Harris with wide, curious eyes, captivated by the story. Mr. Harris smiled at her, the tenderness in his expression unmistakable. "You know, Lily," he said gently, "your grandmother reminds me so much of mine. She was always there for me, just like your grandma is for you." The words hung in the air, a quiet tribute to the bond between Mary and Lily. As he continued, Mr. Harris's voice grew more introspective. "When I was your age, Lily, I didn't understand everything my grandmother did for me. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized the sacrifices she made." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at Mary. "I see that same strength in you, Mary. The way you care for your granddaughter, it's clear how much you love her." Mary felt her eyes welling up, touched by the unexpected kindness of this man who had been a stranger only hours before. Mary, overwhelmed by the emotions stirred by Mr. Harris's words, found herself sharing a bit of her own story. She spoke of the challenges she faced as a single grandmother, raising Lily on a fixed income, doing everything in her power to give her the best life possible. "It's not easy," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But she's my world. I'd do anything for her." Mr. Harris nodded, understanding all too well the weight of her words. There was a shared understanding between them, a connection forged by similar experiences and values. The conversation flowed naturally, the walls that had been built by the evening's earlier tension slowly crumbling. Mr. Harris shared more about his grandmother, how she had taught him the value of hard work, integrity, and kindness. She always said, "No matter how little you have, you can always give something, whether it's your time, your attention, or your kindness." Those words had stayed with him, guiding him throughout his life and shaping the way he ran his business. As the evening wore on, the connection between Mr. Harris and Mary deepened. He could see in her the same resilience, the same quiet strength that had defined his grandmother. It was this recognition that had driven him to step in earlier, to protect Mary's dignity when it was being unfairly challenged. "I wanted to make sure you knew that you're not alone," he said softly. "There are people who understand, who see the good you're doing, even if it's not always acknowledged." Mary nodded, her heart full of gratitude. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, but it had led to a moment of profound connection and understanding. She felt seen, not just as an old woman struggling to make ends meet, but as a person with a story, a history, and a deep love for her granddaughter. Mr. Harris's words had touched something deep within her, offering comfort and a sense of solidarity that she hadn't expected to find. As the evening's conversation wound down, the reality of the situation began to weigh on Mr. Harris. While he had managed to calm the immediate tension, the underlying conflict was far from resolved. The waitress, who had so harshly accused Mary, still lingered near the kitchen, her expression a mix of resentment and embarrassment. Mr. Harris knew he had to address this, not only for Mary's sake, but also for the integrity of his restaurant. His principles were clear, but the consequences of standing by them were daunting. The restaurant was his livelihood, and he had always prided himself on maintaining a respectful and welcoming environment. However, the waitress's behavior had brought to light a simmering issue that he couldn't ignore. Prejudice, even in its most subtle forms, had no place in his establishment. But standing up against it could mean losing an employee, or worse, alienating customers who might share her views. The stakes were high, and the weight of the decision rested heavily on his shoulders. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, knowing that his next steps would define not only the outcome of this evening, but also the future of his business. He called the waitress over, his voice calm but firm. She approached reluctantly, her eyes downcast, fully aware that she had overstepped. "We need to talk," he said quietly, leading her to a more private corner of the restaurant. The waitress followed, the tension between them palpable. The other staff members exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the situation. Once they were out of earshot of the customers, Mr. Harris faced the waitress directly. "What happened tonight was unacceptable," he began, his voice steady but laced with disappointment. "You judged someone based on assumptions, and in doing so, you humiliated a customer who did nothing wrong." The waitress opened her mouth to defend herself, but Mr. Harris held up a hand to stop her. "I understand that mistakes happen, but this was more than a mistake. This was prejudice, and it has no place here." The waitress's face flushed with a mix of shame and anger. She hadn't expected to be called out so directly, and the realization of her actions began to sink in. I didn't mean to," she started, but the words faltered as she struggled to justify what she had done. Mr. Harris's stern gaze held her in place, his silence demanding introspection. She had to confront the fact that her actions had been driven by biases she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Mr. Harris let the silence linger, giving the waitress a moment to reflect. "I believe in second chances," he said finally, his tone softer but still resolute. "But only if you're willing to learn from this and change. If you can't do that, then this might not be the right place for you." The waitress looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and regret. The gravity of the situation was clear. Her job was on the line, but more than that, her integrity was being called into question. The decision hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on both of them. The waitress nodded slowly, the reality of what she had done finally sinking in. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't realize, mister." Harris nodded, accepting her apology but making it clear that words alone weren't enough. Apologizing is a start, but actions speak louder. You need to prove that you understand why this can't happen again. As the waitress returned to her duties, subdued and thoughtful, mister, Harris knew that the hardest part was still ahead. He had to decide how to address the situation publicly in a way that upheld the values he believed in without causing further division. He couldn't afford to alienate his customers, but neither could he allow such behavior to go unchecked. It was a delicate balance, one that required both firmness and compassion. Back at the table, Mary and Lily were finishing their dessert, the earlier tension slowly dissolving. "Mister," Harris approached them, his heart heavy with the decision he knew he had to make. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could ensure that Mary left his restaurant with her dignity intact. "I hope this evening hasn't been completely ruined," he said, his voice gentle. Mary smiled weakly, her eyes reflecting the emotional toll of the night. "It's been memorable," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "Mister," Harris hesitated for a moment, then spoke the words that had been weighing on him. "I want you to know that what happened tonight doesn't reflect the values of this restaurant," he said earnestly. "You are always welcome here, and I will make sure that something like this never happens again." Mary looked at him, her expression softening. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine remorse that underscored his words. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough to begin healing the wounds of the evening. As the tension from the earlier confrontation began to dissipate, Mr. Harris knew that words alone weren't enough to mend the wounds inflicted that evening. He wanted to do more than just apologize. He wanted to make a gesture that would truly show Mary and Lily that they were valued and respected. After a moment of reflection, an idea formed in his mind, one that would not only demonstrate his sincerity, but also offer a tangible form of kindness. He approached their table once more, determination in his stride. "Mary, mister," Harris began, his voice warm and filled with resolve. "I know this evening didn't go as planned, and I can't undo what happened. But I would like to do something to make it right." Mary looked up at him, a mix of curiosity and hesitation in her eyes. She had already received an apology, and the dessert had been a kind gesture, but there was something in Mr. Harris's tone that suggested he had more in mind. Lily, sensing something important was about to happen, turned her wide eyes to the owner, waiting expectantly. "Mr. Harris continued, his gaze steady and sincere. "I'd like to offer you both something more than just an apology. As a token of my appreciation and respect, I'd like to invite you back to the restaurant, anytime you wish, for a meal on the house. And not just for tonight. Anytime you want, you're welcome here as my guests." The offer was generous, far beyond what Mary had expected, and it took her a moment to process the magnitude of his words. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. Lily's face lit up with excitement, but Mary's reaction was more subdued, though no less touched. She had never been offered such kindness before, especially from someone who barely knew her. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Harris," she finally managed to say, her voice soft with emotion. "But I don't want to impose, Mr. Harris shook his head, smiling gently. "You're not imposing, Mary. This is my way of showing you that you're valued here, that what happened tonight is not what this restaurant stands for." The sincerity in Mr. Harris's voice left no room for doubt. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering respect and acknowledgement of the hardships Mary faced. It was a gesture that transcended the events of the evening, one that spoke to a deeper understanding of the struggles many people like Mary endured daily. Mary felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes welling up with tears that she quickly blinked away. The kindness of this man, who had no reason to go out of his way for her, was overwhelming. Lily, with the innocence of a child, tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and whispered, "Can we come back tomorrow, Grandma?" The question, so pure and unfiltered, brought a smile to Mary's face and a chuckle to Mr. Harris's lips. "Of course you can, Lily, Mr. Harris said warmly, kneeling down to be at eye level with the little girl. "And I'll make sure you get the best seat in the house, just for you." Lily beamed at him, her earlier fears forgotten in the wake of this newfound friendship. Mary finally found her voice, filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," she said, her words heartfelt. "You've done more than enough tonight. You've made us feel welcome, and that's something we don't always experience." Mr. Harris nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "It's the least I can do," he replied. "This place is meant to be a sanctuary, a place where everyone is treated with dignity and kindness. I want you to know that you're always welcome here." As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Harris escorted Mary and Lily to the door, ensuring they left with smiles instead of the sadness that had marked the start of their meal. The other patrons watched with a mix of admiration and reflection, having witnessed not just an act of generosity, but a moment of humanity that reminded them of the importance of compassion. Mr. Harris's gesture wasn't just about free meals. It was about restoring dignity and offering hope in a world that often forgot the value of both. Once outside, Mary paused, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The evening had taken many unexpected turns, but as she looked down at Lily, who was still smiling brightly, she realized that it had ended in a way she hadn't anticipated, in kindness and generosity, and in renewed faith in others. She squeezed Lily's hand gently, her heart full of gratitude for the man who had turned a difficult night into a memory of warmth and connection. Mr. Harris watched them go, his heart lightened by the knowledge that he had done the right thing. As Mary and Lily left the restaurant, the warmth of Mr. Harris's generosity lingered, not just with them, but with everyone who had witnessed the evening's events. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. The earlier tension had given way to a quiet reflection among the patrons and staff. The regular customers, who had seen the confrontation unfold, found themselves rethinking their perceptions. The small act of kindness had left an indelible mark on everyone present, reminding them of the power of empathy and understanding. The waitress, who had initiated the misunderstanding, returned to her duties with a heavy heart. The confrontation with Mr. Harris had been a wake-up call, forcing her to confront her own prejudices. She moved through the restaurant with a subdued demeanor, her mind replaying the events of the evening. The way Mr. Harris had handled the situation, with firmness but also compassion, left a deep impression on her. It was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget, one that would shape her interactions with others from that day forward. As the night progressed, the mood in the restaurant gradually lightened. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone, more thoughtful, more aware. The patrons, many of whom were regulars, shared knowing glances, silently acknowledging the significance of what they had just witnessed. Mr. Harris's decision to stand up for Mary had reminded them all of the values that truly mattered. It wasn't just about the food or the service. It was about the community they had created together. Word of the evening's events began to spread beyond the walls of the restaurant. The regulars who had been there shared the story with friends and family, and soon the tale of Mr. Harris's kindness became a talking point in the neighborhood. People admired his integrity, his willingness to do the right thing even when it wasn't the easiest choice. The restaurant, already beloved by many, became even more respected, a place known not just for its food, but for the principles it stood for. For Mary, the impact of Mr. Harris's kindness went beyond the immediate relief of the situation. As she and Lily walked home, the cool night air brushing against their faces, she couldn't help but reflect on the evening's events. What had started as a simple birthday dinner had turned into a profound experience, one that restored her faith in the goodness of others. She knew that the memory of this night would stay with her for a long time, a reminder that there were still people in the world who cared, who saw her for who she truly was. Lily, too, was changed by the evening. Though young, she understood that something important had happened. The kindness shown to her grandmother, the generosity of Mr. Harris, and the way the tension had melted into warmth left an impression on her young heart. As they walked, she held her grandmother's hand tightly, feeling safe and loved in a way she hadn't before. The experience had brought them even closer, and Lily knew that this was a night she would remember for the rest of her life. Back at the restaurant, Mr. Harris observed the subtle changes in his staff and customers. He saw how the events of the evening had sparked quiet conversations, how his staff moved with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the impact of his actions would ripple through his restaurant for days to come, influencing the way his employees treated each other and their patrons. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had not only done the right thing, but had also set an example for others to follow. The community around the restaurant began to take notice of the subtle shifts. Regulars returned with stories of the night, and newcomers came in, curious about the place they had heard so much about. The restaurant, which had always been a staple of the neighborhood, became a symbol of kindness and integrity. Mr. Harris, though modest, accepted the praise with quiet gratitude, knowing that his actions had made a difference, not just for Mary and Lily, but for everyone who had been touched by their story. In the days that followed, the restaurant saw an increase in visitors, many of whom came specifically because they had heard about Mr. Harris's generosity. Some came to thank him personally, others simply to experience the warmth and community that had become synonymous with his establishment. For Mr. Harris, it was never about the recognition. It was about doing what was right, about fostering a space where everyone was treated with respect and dignity. The impact of his decision had grown beyond the walls of his restaurant, reaching into the hearts of the community at large. As the days passed, the story of Mary and Lily's evening at the restaurant became more than just an anecdote. It evolved into a symbol of the power of kindness and the importance of standing up for what is right. The community continued to talk about it, each retelling of the story highlighting different aspects of the experience. Some focused on Mr. Harris's decisive actions, while others reflected on the transformation of the waitress. But all agreed that the night had taught valuable lessons that resonated far beyond the walls of the restaurant. For Mr. Harris, the experience reaffirmed the values he had always held dear but had never been forced to put to such a public test. He reflected on the events with a sense of quiet pride, not because he had been praised, but because he had remained true to his principles. He had been raised to believe that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances, and this belief had guided him throughout his life. The night with Mary and Lily reminded him of the impact those values could have when put into action. Mary, too, found herself reflecting on the evening in the days that followed. She had always known the importance of resilience and kindness, having lived a life where both were often in short supply. But Mr. Harris's generosity had shown her that kindness could be found in unexpected places and that there were still people in the world who recognized and valued the quiet strength she had always tried to embody. The experience left her feeling seen, respected, and most importantly, hopeful. Lily, though young, learned a lesson that would stay with her for years to come. The events of that night showed her that kindness was not just something to be given, but also something to be received with grace. She realized that her grandmother's strength was something to be admired, and that the world could be a better place if more people were like Mr. Harris. As she grew older, the memory of that night would serve as a guiding light, reminding her of the values of kindness, respect, and standing up for what is right. The restaurant became a gathering place for those who wanted to be part of something more than just a meal. Customers came not only for the food, but for the sense of community that had been strengthened by the events of that evening. Mr. Harris noticed that his regulars were more engaged, more connected with each other, and that newcomers were often welcomed with open arms. The restaurant had always been a place where people came to eat, but now it was also a place where they came to feel part of something meaningful. The waitress who had sparked the incident underwent her own transformation. She carried with her the guilt of that night, but instead of allowing it to fester, she chose to use it as a catalyst for change. She became more mindful of her actions, more empathetic in her interactions with customers, and more committed to treating everyone with the respect they deserved. Her journey was not an easy one, but the lesson she had learned was invaluable, shaping her into a better person and employee. As the story of that night continued to spread, it began to take on a life of its own. People from outside the community heard about it and were inspired by the simple yet powerful message it conveyed. It wasn't just about a restaurant owner standing up for a customer. It was about the broader idea that kindness and respect could change lives. The story became a reminder that in a world often filled with division and prejudice, small acts of generosity and understanding could have a profound and lasting impact. Mr. Harris often thought about his grandmother in the days that followed. He knew that she would have been proud of him, not for the recognition he received, but for the choices he made. Her teachings had guided him throughout his life, and now, more than ever, he felt her presence in the decisions he made each day. The restaurant had always been her dream, and by upholding the values she had instilled in him, he felt he was honoring her memory in the best way possible. In the end, the lessons learned from that evening were not just for those directly involved, but for everyone who heard the story. It was a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, to stand up for what is right, and to treat others with the dignity they deserve. The impact of Mr. Harris's actions rippled out into the world, touching the lives of countless people who were inspired to be a little kinder, a little more understanding, and a little more courageous in the face of adversity. As Mary and Lily continued with their lives, the memory of that evening stayed with them. It became a touchstone, a reminder of the goodness that still existed in the world. They returned to the restaurant many times, each visit a testament to the lasting bond they had formed with Mr. Harris. And each time they did, they carried with them the lessons learned, passing them on to others in their own quiet, gentle way. As the story of Mary, Lily, and Mr. Harris comes to a close, we're reminded of how even the smallest acts of kindness can change lives. If this story moved you, imagine what other stories on our channel might inspire you even more. We got another video ready for you. Just click on the one on your screen to continue this journey of heartfelt moments and powerful lessons. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any future stories that touch the heart and lift the spirit. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How did this story resonate with you? Share your reflections below. Thank you for watching. And remember, every act of kindness has the power to create a ripple effect. See you in the next video.